All right, well, we're going to start now. So there's a number of people on the line. So welcome to SACOG workshop on the missing middle. Today we have Dan Paralek, who's going to be speaking about the missing middle, what it is, and what it means to your jurisdictions. So before we do that, a couple of announcements. Most of you are planners for local jurisdictions that are on the phone as well as here in the audience. So earlier today, the SACOG board adopted or approved the release of the RENA 4 methodologies. So that's now open for public comment. As soon as we get back to the office, we'll send an email out to everybody, all the housing planners in the region, to let them know that that formally happened. So now we're starting the open public comment period. Also at the same board meeting, Dan, who will be speaking shortly about the missing middle, gave a presentation, and well-received one, to the SACOG board. They had lots of questions, so just want to kind of give you a heads up about the missing middle. They really liked it. They understood the concepts, so they're going to be wanting to possibly check in with you. They'll probably check in with you already about the RENA numbers and methodology, but they may also bring this up. And one of the things that came up, and again, we'll see lots of examples that Dan has for us, but a question that kept coming up from our local members is that, or from our board members, is they want to see examples. They want to hear about examples from other jurisdictions. So what we'd like to do is maybe outside of this arena, but somewhere else, if you can share examples of missing middle, either ones that are in your jurisdiction or places you know of otherwise, because we're getting questions about the practical aspects of it from the elected officials. Fees, issues, challenges from local neighbors, technical effects, how much land do you need, all those sorts of things. Does your code allow it? I think that's probably the single question that came out of that. So with that, today we're going to talk about the missing middle, and we have Dan Paralek. He's the founder of Opticos Design out of Berkeley. He's the one who coined the concept of the missing middle housing, nationally recognized leader in architecture, design, and urban planning. He's been one of the leading practitioners on form-based coding, which is an approach for development, regulation, and design. For those of you planners out there, the Bible on form-based code is he's the lead author on that, form-based codes. So anyway, today he's going to give us some examples of what missing middle looks like, how to zone for it, and what local governments can do. So with that, Dan Paralek.
Great. Thanks, Greg. And I apologize for those of you who are in the audience. I don't like to present sitting down. I like to sort of engage better, especially with a small group with speakers. I would imagine I probably need to stick close with for those who are online.
We do have satellite speakers if you want to.
Will they pick up my voice if I stand up?
As long as you're not wandering around, if you're somewhere within the table area.
I'll try this. So.
And I can move too if that helps.
Mouse to your right. Other mouse. Should the right click do it? Or down?
While he's doing that, for those of you that are on the phone, if you want AIA or AICP credits, just email me, gchu@sacog.org. And I'll fill out the form for you, but please do that by end of today. Again, gchu@sacog.org. Also, while he's getting all that set up, if there are questions, I believe, Warren, there's a way that in the chat you can type your questions in, and we'll get to them at some point. Just do this. Sorry.
That's just a PDF.
I know.
Is that the right presentation?
Yeah, looks like there's just, let me just do this. So it's not often that I get to do a presentation as part of a meeting like I did this morning with the SACOG board, where the RENA numbers sort of are the precursor to the missing middle housing conversation, but it sort of was good in a way that it sort of emphasizes a really strong need for us to think about, and more specifically to this conversation, communicate about the need for more diverse housing choices. And I can imagine that in most of the jurisdictions that you work in or for, that in a lot of those communities, RHNA or state housing allocations translates to higher densities, which doesn't translate to really warm, fuzzy feelings of types of projects in the minds of your community. So I think what Missing Middle Housing has done is it has given communities a way to talk about the need for housing choices in a way that can step away from this scary density word, terms like multifamily that come with baggage, and just frame it in a more approachable way so we can get to a successful application. And I apologize for the posting out right in the middle of this, but we've been applying this concept. I started Opticos almost 20 years ago, since our very first public sector project, which was a master plan for Isla Vista in Santa Barbara County, adjacent to UC Santa Barbara. And it was a little bit of shock to us. The second we walked into the door with the first meeting with the Citizen Advisory Committee, they had a really strong message to us as the consultant, was that we're not going to approve or support any density higher than 17 dwelling units per acre in this entire planning area. And it really took us aback a little bit. And we're kind of thinking to ourselves, and we're asking questions, well, what's the magic about 17, and why is 17.1 units per acre bad, or 17.5? Why isn't it 16.5 versus 17? Like, trying to get to the bottom of what this number was and realize that there was no real substance. They just latched onto this number, and they thought 17 units per acre was a really high number. And so what we did to counter this pushback from them is we took them on a walking tour of neighborhoods adjacent to downtown Santa Barbara, and we saw it's a great laboratory, as most, like Midtown is the same laboratory of missing middle types. There's cottage courts, there's fourplexes, there's small mansion apartments, and ultimately we came to this building here, a little C-shaped 2-story courtyard apartment building on about a 100-foot by 100-foot lot. And everybody, this has really good curb appeal. And everybody within that group really loved this courtyard building type. And so we talked a lot about what it was that people liked about it. It had a lot to do with form and scale and the way that the building addresses the street. And so I said, well, if we can write a plan, some policy, and change the zoning to ensure that this is what you get, would you support the plan? And there was, pretty broad consensus. Yeah, like, why wouldn't we support this kind of a project? And so me and my team sort of studied the building a little bit more closely, very quickly, counted the doorbells, counted the mailboxes, counted the meters, calculated lot size, and came back. And the message to this group was, by the way, this building is 45 dwelling units per acre, right? Almost 3 times the density that they thought they were willing to accommodate. And what that did is it was just eye-opening to them, and it moved the conversation and the entire process away from density into a conversation about form and scale, and more particularly to this conversation, building types. Like, what makes this C-shaped courtyard building type attractive in terms of potential application to their community. And so I'm going to start with why this is important to talk about. I'm going to then jump into what missing middle is and how we define it, and then give some examples of what you can do as jurisdictions to implement this, and also what builders are doing in response as cities are removing the barriers. And so the first reason that, and you might be all aware of this, but I always find it really helpful to sort of build up a little bit of the why. And there's been a tremendous shift in household demographics. And I think it's obviously been happening for a while. It didn't just sort of happen overnight, but I think it caught the planning industry, it caught the development industry, policymakers a little bit off guard, because it happened over the course of the recession, and the pent-up demand and the shift wasn't being responded to over a pretty long period of time. And so just to give you some examples of today, that 30% of all households are single-person households, of one person. And you can imagine that 30% of the housing that's either available in your communities or that developers are delivering, I can guarantee 30% of it's not designed and built specific to the needs of that single person household. Another statistic is that by 2025, 75 to 85% of households will not have children. And you know, there's often a conversation in communities about, well, what about housing for families? Yes, we need to think about families, it's important, but families with lots of children are becoming fewer and a smaller and smaller percentage. And so once again, need to be thinking differently about what types of housing we're delivering. And then the last one is we have a rapidly aging population as well. By 2030, that 1 in 5 Americans will be over the age of 65. So obviously that comes with a special set of needs and types of housing that we're really not responding to in terms of what we're delivering in terms of housing. The second thing is there's a very strongly shifting demand for walkable living. And the two biggest market segments, the millennials want, 2/3 of millennials actually want to live in a walkable urban environment, and 1/3 of baby boomers want to live in a walkable urban environment. And I think what's important about that is it's not just they all want to live in downtown Sacramento or downtown San Francisco or downtown Oakland. This is walkability at a neighborhood scale as well, at that 2-story and that 3-story scale, or the small town scale, or the evolving suburban scale. And so this is a really important thing to be thinking about as the market just continues more and more to want that walkability, and that means different things to different jurisdictions, whether you're primarily suburban, rural, have a big sort of a more urban component. So just need to be thinking about that shift in demand. Right, there's obviously, we all know this, we're all in some of the hottest real estate markets in the country, that affordability is just more and more of an issue. I can say as a small business owner in the Bay Area, it's harder and harder to attract employees, and it's harder and harder to retain employees because our employees can't afford to live in the place where we have our business. And so there's lots of cascading implications of that affordability. The second, or the last thing here that I wanted to just mention as an issue, why is this important, is that a lot of our work is focused on working with cities and counties or multi-jurisdictional groups to think about identify how zoning has and why zoning has failed to deliver housing choices, because it really has, conventional zoning has failed to deliver these housing choices. And the reality is it's given density a pretty bad name. And so over the course of the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s, a lot of cities ended up upzoning parts of their communities that actually enabled some pretty ugly infill housing. And there's just, I think we still, we work all across the country. About 60% of our work's in California, 40% in other parts of the country. We see this everywhere of like these projects that happened decades ago. There's still baggage coming along in the community in terms of why would we ever let higher density or rental apartments in any of our neighborhoods or any of our communities. Right, we've also done a really bad job of where we build medium densities, and this is just, I will often ask, right, this is like a conventional suburban garden apartment on the edge of a city along 2 arterial roadways that have 0 walkability. And I've still yet to find anybody in the years of presenting this and discussing this that would choose to live in this context by choice. Right, people live here because it provides an affordable choice, but we can think differently about where this housing can happen and how it can be integrated into a broader walkable community. And then we also, I'm sure many of you, especially those of you who work for jurisdictions that have new growth areas and are still building new communities at the edge of your communities, right? Builders have gotten really, really savvy about building single-family detached houses on the smallest lots possible. And so it's often a product of this, of like There's no really good public space. There's not even a really good front door. There's not a strong sense of community. It's just literally kind of housing for housing's sake that achieves a density of like maybe 14 or 15 units per acre, but really the wrong housing type for delivering the range of diversity and choices. I also laugh about, I'm sure this large water retainage ditch here accounted for their required open space, and it's along the side of a bunch of houses and along a sound wall at the back of a Walmart. So, right, just some really silly patterns that we're reinforcing and builders are building under the current zoning system. And so, second part is, what is missing middle? And many of you might have seen this diagram. We created this diagram, 5 or 6 years ago now. And on the your left-hand side, in the white, are single-family detached houses. We've done a really great job of enabling those in our policy planning and zoning codes. Builders are figured that out. On the right-hand side are the larger 5-plus story condominiums or apartment buildings that, we started planning for 15 to 20 years ago, depending on where you were at. The development communities have figured out how to deliver them, and a lot of places, even smaller jurisdictions across the country, are getting these bigger apartment buildings, and I think that's part of the knee-jerk reaction and the bounce back they're getting to density or additional housing. But it's all these housing choices in the middle. It's the duplex, the triplex, the fourplex, the bungalow court, townhouses that historically were built in almost every neighborhood, built prior to the 1940s, but we have built very, very little of these housing types over the course of the last 50 to 60 years. I think I was just reading something recently in the American Housing Survey that over the course of the last 20 years, only 2% of all housing built fell into the missing middle scale, which we cut off at 19 units per building. And so, it is missing. There's a reason we call it missing, and it's middle in two ways. And I think this is really important because there's often a default that missing middle is solely about affordability and about housing for middle income, and that's definitely a secondary sort of aspect of middle. But first and foremost, in the way you need to communicate to your communities is that it's a middle scale. In this diagram that was created by this organization that had me come in Arlington, Virginia, called the Alliance for Housing Solutions. So their version of the missing middle is great. It's a middle scale between those single-family homes and those 5- and 7-story buildings that a lot of communities are having a knee-jerk reaction against. And that's really important, and it does deliver affordability by design to what we find typically about a 60% of median income or above. And any median income below that would typically need some sort of a subsidy to deliver affordability. But we're also finding there's a tremendous demand at the market rate for these housing types, and our developer clients who are delivering missing middle, there's also a market for it sort of at the upper end of the market that is not being met either. So, right, cities all across the United States, and these are just examples across California. Santa Barbara has a wealth of these types. Smaller towns like San Luis Obispo, that I'm sure most of you are probably fairly familiar with, have just a really amazing collection of the types with just some local variations. San Diego is also a great laboratory for cottage courts and courtyard apartments. And I heard recently, and I need to do some research on this, that during World War II that San Diego removed their zoning requirements in residential districts, and that's when most of the missing middle was actually built. Now, you'd get a much different result today based on the hot real estate values if you were just simply to remove your zoning requirements. So I don't recommend that, but it's just interesting that to respond to that housing crisis related to the war and people moving to San Diego, that's how their missing middle is delivered. And then Sacramento has great examples as well that you just walk through any of the historic neighborhoods and you can see them. So just to dive into some of these types a little bit more, this is a side-by-side duplex. It's a really simple type. It's 2 units just simply pushed together side by side. We don't like to start the conversation about missing middle or these types using density, but we say that you can output a density if you understand the typical lot sizes that are in the lower right-hand corner of this diagram, that they can generate densities of up to 19 units per acre on a 50 by 85 foot lot. And a test for you all who sort of deal with the zoning in your jurisdictions is try to find or test to see if there's a single zoning district in your entire zoning code that allows a duplex on a 50-foot wide lot. And I can guarantee that there's probably, outside of the city of Sacramento, in this entire region, there's probably not a single zoning code that allows a duplex on a 50-foot wide lot. And I'll say that one of our tips is the width of the lot is more important than the area of the lot, because the pattern in most communities is defined by a typical range of lot widths, and the depths vary a little bit, and you don't want a building to get bigger as the lot gets deeper. So that's a really good test for you to take back to your jurisdictions. There's a stacked duplex. This is just go on the right-hand door on the right-hand side. It's a unit on the ground floor. Go on the door on the left and go up the flight of stairs, and there's a unit stacked on top of this. And this type can actually fit on about a 30-foot wide lot. Sorry, it's not actually shown that in the table, but we've actually applied this on 30-foot wide lots and can generate into the low 20 units per acre on a 30-foot wide lot. And so, but this is actually a block in Berkeley that's mostly single-family detached houses that are, that I ride my bike up and down every day on my way to work. But this duplex and another fourplex are integrated into that block, and you would never notice it unless you actually stop to really take a close look at it. And I think that's an important part of this, is they're house-scale buildings that just happen to have multiple units inside of that. And I think if you take one concept away today, it's like when you add more units, it doesn't mean that the building's getting sort of bigger and bigger. It's just meaning that you define a house form, and maybe there's more units, but there's smaller units inside of it. So that's an important concept to take away. The cottage court, I'm sure many of you have at least seen these, either here in Sacramento or some of these other California examples. These are just a series of small, typically detached, sometimes attached units oriented around a shared green space. Typically start at about a 100-foot wide lot. They work best on where there's alleys. But these can actually this type can generate densities of up to the mid-30 units per acre, and that seems really high for, I think, a lot of you, especially maybe if you're working for a more suburban or a smaller jurisdiction, your densities probably cap out at, I would imagine 20s, maybe mid-20s, or they go higher. Okay, so, it's a pretty high density for single-story, single-family detached units oriented onto a lot. So, townhouses are pretty straightforward. I include this slide because most of the examples we show are traditional architecture or even historic examples, but I just wanted to make the point that missing middle can be style neutral. It's not about a style, it's about the building type. Some cities choose to have objective standards that actually achieve a certain style or range of styles or details, and others just kind of are more open to a broader vocabulary within the missing middle context. This is a fourplex. My favorite type, the one that's still missing from most markets these days, it's 2 units on the ground floor and 2 units on the upper floor. In this instance, you go in that door in the middle. Looks like a single-family house. The 2 units on the ground floor enter left and right. There's a door for each of the units that go up to the second-story units. And so this is a great type that generates, once again, about the 30. This can get up to the mid-30 units per acre on slightly smaller lots as well. And I feel like if cities can focus on enabling this fourplex type on a 50-foot wide lot, both as rental and for sale, it'd go a really, really long way to diversifying housing choices and more attainability or affordability in communities. This was an interesting, we went on a walking tour of a neighborhood in Dallas called Bishop Arts neighborhood. And this was actually with AARP. And we found that fourplex, and we were studying the fourplex, and somebody said, well, is that another fourplex right next to it? And it was this building on the right. And when we studied it a little bit more closely, realized the building was the exact same size. The lot was the same size, the building was the same width, the same depth, the same height. But this had 4 one-bedroom units in it, and it generated a density of 36 units per acre. But this building, which is the exact same site, had 8 studio apartments in it, and so it generated a density of 72 units per acre. And I can guarantee if your general plan has a future land use that is 72 units per acre, it's not assuming you're going to get a 2-story house scale building. So just something to think about. It sort of kind of shakes up our concepts of missing middle. The missing middle diagram has been adapted in Australia and in Canada and is being sort of used in their planning as well. I'm not going to talk long about this because I could take a really long time just talking about the barriers, but impact fees, we talked actually at the board meeting, we talked a lot about impact fees as a barrier because a lot of cities have a impact fee per unit. So regardless of the unit is 500 square feet or 5,000 square feet, if you have to pay the same impact fee, you're discouraging the delivery of that small unit. It often makes the projects not pencil out for the smaller units for developers, and we've had that experience in working with developers who had wanted to deliver this and found in the city of Novato, a client of ours wanted to do a pocket neighborhood with single-family detached units at about 850 square feet, and they found out their impact fees per unit were going to be over $70,000 per unit, and so those units had to go up to 2,500 square feet to make the project pencil out, and so they become luxury houses as opposed to a nice small cottage that somebody on a middle, at the median income could afford. Characteristics, right? Walkable context, right, means different thing for different places. If you're in a bigger city, obviously more access to transit and to amenities, but we're also seeing, I know there's been a lot of planning in this region for the evolution, sort of putting the vision in place for the evolution of places that grew up suburban. They have suburban DNA, but they want to evolve, whether it's because a light rail line got extended through their city or just simply knowing that developers want to meet this demand or needing to meet the RENA allocation. So that's really important. And we find that these types, which are shown here in yellow, are a really nice transition from sort of a commercial neighborhood street into a single-family neighborhood. The first couple of lots can be missing middle. So the second characteristic is a lower perceived density. I mean, how many of you in the room here, if you drove by this building, would assume that it was not a single-family house? Right? It looks and feels like a single-family house, and so that's the real point here. One of the main takeaways is this is a triplex, and this is a great missing middle example, recently constructed, looks and feels and behaves like a single-family home. It's on a block that has brand new single-family homes, and it fits in perfectly well. Like you wouldn't even notice the difference if you didn't stop more closely and look. And this is a project that we're working on for a developer. I'm going to show a little bit more, but the concept is right. This is a building that looks like a turn-of-the-century estate house, but it just happens to have 7 units integrated within it. So it's a really interesting concept. Big, house form, more units integrated. The third characteristic is smaller units. And this is a point of trying to get a little bit of a comic relief or a chuckle, where, right, there's the tiny house movement, which is really fantastic. It plays a role. This isn't necessarily tiny house scale. This is, talking about housing, starting at the 600-700 square foot scale. A lot of the historic examples start at like a 700 square foot, small or large 1-bedroom or small 2-bedroom unit. And I think this is important because if you're working in a jurisdiction where you're dealing with production builders, I spoke at a conference that's called the Housing Giants that is sponsored by Professional Builder Magazine, and we started talking about small units, and they were talking about small in the context of like 2,500 square feet. And I was like, well, we need to reframe small in this context of not all units need to be that small, but 600-700 square feet, there's a tremendous demand for it. I'll show you some examples that go up to like 1,300-1,400 square feet, and that can work especially in environments that are transforming suburban contexts, but just important part of the conversation because what I don't understand why it's not more broadly talked about, but a density-based zoning system inherently discourages smaller, more affordable units. Because if you're allowed, let's say you have a lot and you do the calculation, the zoning allows 4 units. Do you think the builder is going to build 4 small, affordable units, or do you think they're going to build 4 of the biggest units that the market's going to sort of accept? Like, it's a no-brainer for developers. And so part of this is like thinking about how do we counter sort of this zoning system that inherently disincentivizes, as well as the impact fees disincentivize smaller units, which the market is really looking for and the market's needing in terms of affordability and attainability. Thoughtful design at all scales. I think this is just, we've seen a lot of instances where developers and their architects are trying to take suburban housing types and cram them into a more compact, sort of more walkable footprint, and there's just a disconnect there between adapting the unit types and the housing types to what that market really wants. But being really thoughtful at the same time of delivering high quality living at the same time as delivering smaller, more compact living. All right. Townhouses fit into the missing middle lexicon, but we're seeing more and more of this, and I'm sure you're seeing it if you have new growth areas where it's a townhouse flipped perpendicular to the street that goes sort of deep into a lot. It's really efficient. Developers love it, but it doesn't create a very livable environment. So I just want a little bit of a warning. Be careful what you're enabling, and sort of thinking carefully about what standards you need to ensure a good site plan, as well as a good mix of the missing middle housing type. So just need to be very thoughtful about that. Because what you see when you go down this street is a bunch of sides of buildings and a bunch of driveways. There's not a really nice, consistent frontage or sense of place. It's just, it feels like housing for medium density housing for housing's sake, just to deliver a number, as opposed to delivering a high quality environment. Fifth characteristic is we need to think about requiring less parking. And I like this. This is a famous Banksy a piece of art down in LA, but I just think to me it sort of captures the spirit of us needing to get creative about how we think about parking and removing some of the regulations and thinking about a larger management strategy. And the reality is that shifting mobility, technology is just making it easier and easier for people to get around. I mean, I'm pretty amazed that even the electric scooters, like, just make it so easy to show up in a place we're working without renting a car to get around. And so important point is we've done a way better job of delivering spaces for cars than we have places for people to live. And that your community will not likely be able to developers won't be able to pencil missing middle types if you're requiring more than one, sometimes 1.5 parking spaces per unit if you're in a more suburban environment. But the point here is, if you don't change your parking requirements, you're not going to get missing middle housing, period. Like, you can think creative in making sure your streets have on-street parking. That sort of serves as the spillover. You can't just not think of a strategy about how to manage it. Requiring guest parking spaces for any sort of rental projects is a very antiquated approach. I'm still shocked that we find that in zoning code. So, and then new living configurations. And I'm sure many of you, at least those of you who are that my age or similar, saw the Golden Girls at some point, where there was a group of friends or acquaintances that decided to share a unit together, and that was a great community. And ARP did a lot of research recently that showed there's more and more of the baby boomer generation like wanting to live together under one rooftop, and just figuring out ways that we can continue to encourage that. Affordable by design, I mentioned this earlier. We often use this barbell. Is on your right-hand side is the subsidized housing. All of these are an important part of the affordability toolbox. On the opposite end is just thinking of ways to increase the housing supply. And the missing middle fits nicely in the middle, where we found in regions across the country is that developers can build and deliver this housing at attainable price points by design, if they're regulated appropriately. So that's just an important part of one of the tools that cities need in their affordable housing toolbox. We're working on a really cool project with Sonoma Habitat for Humanity, Habitat for Humanity, which is this little pocket neighborhood in Santa Rosa, and it's actually, I should have it constructed. It's constructed. The grand opening was a couple weeks ago, and another cool part about this is Sonoma Habitat wanted to test different building delivery systems. So there's a couple of prefabricated companies we tested. There's a modular system that brings in sort of 8-foot by 8-foot panels and puts the house up, and so we're able to actually compare time efficiencies and cost efficiencies over those series of companies. And so the idea was that Sonoma can use these models either as like an ADU unit in the back of an existing house, or a temporary housing choice for people whose houses got burnt down and they're waiting for their house to be constructed, or just smaller infill opportunities throughout that region as well. And last of all is that these types provide community. And it seems like a no-brainer here, but what we're finding and what our developer clients are finding is more and more of buyers and renters are looking for a strong sense of community. And this can either be delivered by a broader neighborhood. Maybe you live in a neighborhood that has a lot of block parties, has a lot of walkability, has a great coffee shop where things happen, or it could be defined in a project like this pocket neighborhood that has that shared green space, and it has a shared community room where you cook meals together. Could be formally structured as co-housing as well. Okay, and here's just some quick strategies of how you can integrate missing middle. And the first one is just thinking about, and I think it's really important to be thinking about missing middle at the general plan level. Nashville was actually one of the first cities in the country to adopt the missing middle policies into their comprehensive plan, and now they've done a lot of form-based coding to deliver it. But what we find in a lot of general plans is you see some very vague classifications. On the top in the yellow, the creamy yellow, is primarily single family. And what we find is a lot of these types historically are integrated into a neighborhood that has this perception and the scale of a single family, and the general plan kind of completely either ignores or just doesn't sort of identify the fact that there's a mix of housing in those neighborhoods. And the brown here is like a category that's trying to get there. It's called a mix of housing types, but it clusters like a really broad range of those big multifamily buildings and suburban garden apartments in with clusters of the missing middle housing type. So it's kind of a too blunt of an instrument. So I'm just encourage you to be thinking really specifically in your land use elements about missing middle housing. And just as an example, is you could create a district that's either medium density or high density, but it's a small scale specifically. Sort of medium density residential small scale would be just like an example of what you could do in your general plans. No-brainer to integrate this into small area plans, whether it might be precise plans or specific plans. Along corridors, like we're seeing this a lot as a really great tool to fill in some of the gaps and even take the place in some instances of some of the dead or economically unviable early strip malls along those corridors, maybe with some designated smaller scale mixed use. If you're in a community that has corridors that were designated for higher intensity buildings, maybe those 5 to 7 story buildings, the transit corridor, or just a priority corridor in your general plan. In this diagram, you're seeing those bigger 5 to 7 story buildings on the upper right-hand side of that corridor in the diagram. But then as you move down to your left, you see the missing middle scale functioning as a transition from that bigger scale into the single-family neighborhoods. And then larger grayfield sites, maybe you have a dead mall or a dying mall that you need to think creatively about, or a developer comes to the table where you can get those 5 to 7 story residential buildings along the corridor, but then as you transition, those lots are typically fairly large, 20, 30, 40, 50 acres, of thinking about how the missing middle can serve as that transition from that big into the single-family neighborhoods that are likely adjacent to this neighborhood. And then talking a little bit about fixing zoning barriers. I would say that I would guess that most of your zoning codes can't tell the difference between the building on the right and the building on the left. It's just the reality. Even if the intent is good, the height is the same, the setbacks are the same, the density is the same, but we can tell from a perception and the way you perceive those buildings and how they add to the community, they're very different buildings. And so these elements that are on this left-hand building here, which a lot of community members would be happy to accommodate and not this one on the right, are the types of elements that we would integrate into a form-based code. And part of it's the frontage and the way the building addresses the street, but we need to be thinking about just beyond the metrics that are in a lot of your probably 30, 40, 50-year-old zoning codes. And the most basic concept here within missing middle is you do probably need to dial up your densities, but you need to regulate a maximum width of building, and you need to regulate a maximum depth of the building. Otherwise, it'll encourage builders to aggregate lots and just deliver very large buildings that, in a lot of locations, that's okay, but in more specific locations where you want this house scale, you have to be much more specific. We've written form-based codes across the country. This is an example from Cincinnati, Ohio, which is obviously an urban location. We've done it in Beaufort County, South Carolina, which was a combination of suburban transforming into walkable and rural. We've done it in Kauai County. We've done it in Petaluma. We did it, actually, Grass Valley. I was telling Greg, Grass Valley was one of the first examples of where we applied it to the downtown and adjacent neighborhoods in Grass Valley. We're doing it in San Rafael. We're doing it in downtown Davis right now as the transitions. So there's been a lot of really wide variety of applications of this. But the point here is that instead of putting a density metric or an FAR metric and keeping your fingers crossed and hoping that developers are going to deliver the types, we actually list an allowed range of missing middle types specifically in each of the form-based zoning districts. So this is a illustrative intent for one of the zoning districts. These are the range of missing middle units that are allowed, but it does, one of the important things, it gives a minimum lot width for each of those building types. So somebody's not trying to cram the wrong building type on a too small of a lot, which you will get if you don't address that. This is just an example I'll go through really quickly because I'm already taking a long time here, but this was an interesting example in Novato where if any of you might have met Bob Brown, he was the interim planning director. He was hired to get their general plans update approved, and as part of that, he picked, this was a sort of an area, it's called the Northwest Quadrant. Their downtown is just to the right. It's sort of the Main Street sort of passes along the southern edge of this project area. It was kind of a very controversial community because it had really bad infill in the 70s. There was contradictions between their general plan, zoning, and a neighborhood plan that was done in like 1977. All three of them allowed a different number of units, and so they brought us in to do a community process to kind of get beyond this argument about this density number and talk about what actually should be allowed from a form and scale standpoint. So this is just an example, right, of typical 50 by 150 foot lot. 150 foot lot depth is pretty deep, but they had that. This is what their zoning allowed by right. And one of the messages here is just because your zoning allows single family doesn't mean you're going to get a form or type of result that you want. Because this is a single family house, but there was nothing in the zoning that didn't allow the big garage door on the front or parking on the front yard, and it allowed it to go up to 3 stories with a flat roof, right? And so this was eye-opening to the community members of, oh, yeah, that's not really, we thought we wanted only single family, but that's not what we wanted either. So it kind of sort of started a really healthy conversation within the community. We said, well, by the way, your general plan, if somebody can navigate through, the argument of your general plan allows 3 and your zoning allows 2, there's nothing that would disallow somebody from doing this, right? Parking in the front, unattractive carport, house pushed to the back, no entry, no visibility, no windows. We're like, well, we need to make sure that doesn't happen if we allow more than single family detached. So we have this conversation about, hey, this is a 4-plex, right? 2 units on the ground floor, 2 units on the upper floor. They're smaller units. But hey, what if we gave the developer the right to do more units, but you had these other objective standards in terms of you got to have an entry, the parking has to be tucked way to the back, and right, nice visibility and interface with the street. And so it just opened up a really healthy conversation in that community about it doesn't need to be a worse project if it has more units, but the form and scale and character is just as important as the number of units. So that was important. We just completed this study for National Association of Home Builders that we studied efforts from cities across the country and what changes they made in their zoning to enable missing middle scale housing. It's a really great resource. You can download this for free if you just Google the name Diversifying Housing Options with Smaller Lots and Smaller Homes. That's a mouthful. I told them we needed a shorter name, but that's it. A great resource that was just completed in the last month or so. I do want to mention, Greg mentioned the form-based code book. I was realizing this makes me feel old, but that was published 10 years ago. We do have a contract to do a second edition. I can't find time to do it. But the Form-Based Code Institute, if you haven't been on it's a nonprofit that I helped found now almost 15 years ago. If you go online and if you have people in your community, whether it be your city manager, your council members, your county board of supervisors, they want to know more, there's a wealth of really great information, including like a little 3-minute video on form-based coding on the Form-Based Code Institute's website. So that's a really great resource, as well as some courses that me and a group of my peers taught for Plan Edison. That was like 3 or 4 years ago. So I do want to encourage, we recently started doing this work where cities understood our real expertise in this topic, and they started hiring us to specifically identify what barriers are in place in their general plan / comprehensive plan, depending on what state you're in, their small area plans, like a downtown plan, a neighborhood plan, a corridor plan, and their zoning codes. And what was interesting about this is, and I actually think this is a tremendous, this would be a tremendous use of SB2 funding to get you to objective design standards, but I like using this because it's the most recent example that we have completed. It's in Greenville County, and Greenville, the city of Greenville, South Carolina, hired us to do this missing middle scan. And it's really fun we really dig very deeply, and we deliver a set of very specific recommendations on the barriers that need to be removed. And then if cities can either choose to do that on their own, and a lot of them do, because of limited budget, and maybe just call us in for peer review. But it's just a really great strategy because it defines the barriers, but it also defines where we call missing middle ready contexts. So we analyze, we sort of do a bunch of mapping of like where these types exist, where the right lot sizes exist, where there's walkability, and we actually give them a map that shows where they should incentivize and enable missing middle. And in Greenville's sake, they're about to start their comprehensive plan, so this is basically going to plug right into their land use element within their comprehensive plan. They're going to say, this is where we need to enable this. Let's make sure those land use classifications are enabling missing middle in these locations. And then what's interesting about this is that the dotted lines the dashed lines on the lower end of this table represent where their zoning districts, the maximum densities their zoning districts allow, which cap out at about 20 units per acre. And each of the green bars represents one of these missing middle housing types and what densities you would typically need to enable these missing middle types. And you can see there's a big disconnect, especially as you go beyond a duplex, of like the allowed densities and what needs to be allowed to enable the missing middle type. So that was really eye-opening for the local planning staff when they started thinking about this. We systematically went through each of their area plans. This would be an equivalent to a specific plan or a precise plan, and talked about what within that plan either reinforced, was a barrier, or maybe was neutral on missing middle housing. And we find that, unfortunately, in a place like Greenville, and we see this a lot, they had almost 20 small area plans, and only the 2 most recently completed plans actually fully enabled, because they did a form-based code, enabled the missing middle type. So they were been trying for 20 years, and are sort of still running into the challenge of having barriers. I just wanted to mention, I was talking with Greg and Dove from his staff about this over lunch, but really exciting application that we're just getting started is we've been hired by Marin County to create a template that will be used by the county and 10 jurisdictions in the county to meet their objective design standards criteria. This is an SB2 funded project. So I just encourage you to keep an eye on this one because there's a really broad range of municipalities from really small towns to fairly suburban. I think the only city that opted not to jump in is San Rafael because our firm and a group of other firms are already working with them. So it's one for you to keep an eye out open for, and I think it's a really great sort of way to be thinking about applying SB2 funds. Cities are building pilot projects. We did talk a little bit about this at the board meeting, but cities are stepping up, and I haven't found a city in California, and I think, right, it needs to happen. A city like Decatur, Georgia, they bought a lot, or they owned the lot, they partnered with a builder, and they're delivering this little pocket neighborhood, and it's a permanent, affordable housing. I think it's a land trust model, and just encourage you to sort of look at some of these models as ways to prove the concept in the market. I mean, even AARP, AARP hired us about a year and a half ago as part of their livable community strategies. They've made missing middle housing one of their priorities, and we've now in several states across the country been hired by AARP to do workshops and education about the benefits of missing middle. And I think, number one, this is great because that's a big market segment that's sort of looking for this. But secondly is, I mean, it's an overgeneralization, but a lot of the pushback that we see in a lot of communities comes from that older demographic that has lived in a community for a very long time and just has a hard time envisioning that change. So, oh, great. Hey. Yeah, they've been a great champion, and actually, I'll say that the California AARP chapter did a 3-part video series that they recorded me talking about missing middle housing over a 3-part series, so you can look at that as well. I just wanted to mention how the builders are responding, and I should do this quickly because this is a completely new missing middle neighborhood on 40 acres on a site in the Omaha, Nebraska metro. And this is a project that we worked with a developer on. We did the site planning as well as developed the building types. The reason I think this is important is for 2 reasons. If this is happening in Omaha, Nebraska, the rents in Omaha are about $1.30 per square foot. So if a developer can make this pencil out in Omaha, Nebraska, I can guarantee they can make this pencil out in any market in Northern California, or any part of California for that matter. So exciting part of this is we worked with them to develop a set of unit plans that they sort of pre-approved and checked it off. And we put those unit plans together in a series of different ways to create 7 different missing middle housing types. And so it's not a matter of having one building that gets repeated over and over on the plan, but a series of 7 different house scale buildings that create a real nice diversity on this project, a series of different addresses that are created, a Main Street environment that actually has been, you'll see photos, estate home, mansion apartment environment, typical block, townhouse over flats, and the first phase is built. Right, they built the Main Street environment to create that walkability. They're incubating a coffee shop in their co-working space in the corner of these spaces. Nice mix of 4-plex, 6-plex, 5-plex. So it's just exciting that it's proved the concept and it's proved it in a market that has some of the lowest rents in the country. And the last example I'm going to show is how single-family builders, just because I know many of you probably have those conversations with single-family production builders that say, there's not a market for it, we can't do it, the market won't accept it, it's too expensive. This builder, Homes, is one of the largest builders in the Salt Lake City region. He called us a couple years ago now, and he said, we have 2 issues that I have no idea how to address. We know the market is shifting. Our business model is delivering single-family homes. We don't have any idea how to shift to meet this market demand because it's outside of our bread and butter. The second comment was we started building townhouses, like the tuck-under townhouse with the ground, that's the parking, and then the 2 units above it. He said, but how prices have gone up so much, labor, materials, entitlement, that we can actually deliver that townhouse at a price point that an entry-level buyer can afford. And I would imagine a lot of builders in this region are having a similar problem, trying to figure out what to do with it. And so we actually designed this, what we call the Muse housing type for them. It was a huge success. They were able to deliver these housing types at a price point of 25 to 30 grand less than their townhouse. What I like about it is the units start at about 900, little over 900 square feet, go up to 1,400, right, bigger than that small end. But because they're small and because they're at a entry-level price point doesn't mean they can't be highly livable. Like, they have double-story living spaces, they have lots of natural light, they have about little outdoor courtyard space, and so, right, this is being done, not being done widely, and it's being, builders are shifting a little bit too slowly. But like, really interesting project that was done by a large production builder. It was totally outside their comfort zone the entire way. Like, they were very anxious. They kind of let us push this further than we thought. But we're really excited about it. A couple of concluding thoughts. Just want to mention, be on the lookout for, I'm just finishing up a book on missing middle housing for Island Press. That'll be available in the spring, so just look out for that. If you haven't been on it, we launched a free online resource, missingmiddlehousing.com, several years ago. It just has a lot of free information. It's just a good, it's a good resource. I think the part that people find most helpful in communicating is there's a large photo database of each of the types on the website, and we find that photographs are a great way to start this conversation with your communities. Is like, make a poster of each of these housing types and talk about the benefits of those types, who would live in them, why they're needed. That's a great starting point. Don't talk about density. Don't talk about multifamily. They could be rental or for sale. It's a great intro using the photographs. And I just like ending on this quote because it's from a ULI publication. It's time to reinvent and it's time to rethink and evolve and reinvent and renew. And what I like about this is it's a bit of a call to arms. And it's right, this isn't just a crazy concept that planners are talking about, and they, like, this is a real need. Builders are talking about it. City decision makers are talking about it. They know the need. They know to think outside the box. Planners are talking about it. Architects are talking about it. ARP, groups like ARP are talking about it. 38 million, I think, members nationally or internationally. And I think each one of us, regardless of where you fall in that spectrum, play a really important role in, being part of the solution. I mean, I think, we have the reality of RHNA numbers and new RHNA numbers and growing RHNA numbers that are sort of waking us all up and making communities realize that we need to do something fairly drastic and need to be thinking outside the box to do this. But I think this is a great way to introduce the need for more housing and different types of housing in a way that's not scary to community members. And so I just feel like the market is there, the need is there, and we all play a role. And right, each one of us need to step up and play a role in responding to that need. Thank you. Question?
Yeah, questions either online or live. So, and if you're online, go ahead and type them in to our chat box.
So I'll repeat the question. The question was, how are minimum setbacks affecting density? I would say setbacks play a really important role in either being a barrier or enabling missing middle, especially on corner lots, which often have really side setbacks or side street setbacks. So I'd say as you're calibrating your code, we have a set of drawings that we've done, like we've taken a fourplex and kept the footprint the same and studied different lot sizes and different setback requirements. And just to show, start by talking about the output of the density. He's taking all the city staff out there to have a conversation. Can't reestablish and become the new standards because it's so successful and it's become a real sort of trademark project for this city. So it's interesting in a lot of ways.
Or can we Google this?
So Urban Village is the name of the developer. He's based in Omaha. Sorry, the company's based in Omaha. The project goes by two names. The name while we were working on it through planning was Prairie Queen, but it also goes by Urban Waters now in their marketing. They hired a marketing consultant. They felt they needed a different name. So if you just Google that, if you don't find it, I'm happy to share the link directly.
Prairie Queen or Urban Waters?
Urban Waters. And it's in Papillion, Nebraska, which is larger Omaha metro. And what I told him is now that the first phase is done and he knows how to manage the project efficiently, because I think the other thing we hear from a lot of cities is that, oh, developers have told us we can't do this because the management would cost too much, because it's not like one or two really big buildings, and this project will prove that that is not the case. And I think that's really important. I told him he needs to write a white paper that should be broadly distributed across the country so that, you know, if the developers are telling a city it's not viable, that you can like take that white paper and say, look, here's a project. Give Urban Village a call, ask them how they did it. A big reason the project penciled out was super efficient with the land in that one off-street parking space per unit, all off of an alley, just either head in off of an alley or a garage off an alley, and the second space or additional spaces were on street. And so there are no big parking lots. And that was part of building a sense of community, as well as just being really efficient and smart about not having to build a street and a big parking lot. So, interesting.
Fascinating project. Other questions? Go ahead, Kate. Yeah. Let me just repeat the question for the phone audience. So just repeat what the quick fixes are for people who don't have a phone code.
Yeah, it's a great question, because what we find in more and more of our projects are targeted fixes. Like Nevada was create one new zoning district. So that was actually a form-based district that just got inserted directly into their zoning code. We're actually doing that more and more. Other ways, like Mountain View right now is starting a process. They have an R3 district that they just want to fix it. Let's just fix this one zone. Bring us in and just fix that one zone. So there's a number of things you can do. You could go in and tweak densities. You can just dial up densities. You have to be, if you're going to dial up your densities, you want to make sure you do regulate maximum width and depth of a building, so that you don't encourage lot aggregation and bigger buildings than you would encourage. You need to think about your parking. And I would say, as a starting point, make sure you allow, at the very least, a duplex and ideally a fourplex on a 50-foot wide lot. So take a lot in your community that's 50-foot wide and whatever the typical depth, that's usually 100 to 150, and just test your parking requirements, your setbacks, and just make sure you can get, you can look on the Missing Middle website. It gives general characteristics of like typical building widths and building depths and such, and you can use that information to calibrate your zoning code. So it's, more and more cities are just doing that really targeted, and I think there's no reason you need to get caught up in a big sort of citywide zoning code effort or even a form-based code if what you need is a more targeted effort. And we tell cities, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So find out what's broken. And a lot of what we do in these Missing Middle scans is really specific identifications of what's broken. And then you have your targeted fixes at that point. That seems much more tangible and less intimidating, I guess. And you can get build political support more readily for a targeted effort like that. So yeah, I did a session at APA this year in San Francisco. That was zoning hacks for Missing Middle, and it sort of talked about that. I think that should be available online, but if not, I'm happy to share I have one slide that just lists like the 8 things you should sort of start at the top and check the boxes of.
Other questions? So any final advice that you might hand off to the local, most audiences, local planners in the Sacramento area?
I think number one, don't be afraid to start small. Building upon your question of don't feel like it needs to be this big thing. I mean, some cities need a big solution. Others need smaller, more targeted. It's kind of like the tactical urbanism of zoning, right? Let's just get really tactical and get in there and make some fixes. I would encourage you, number one, like, SB2 money is available. Make sure the submittals are due in the next couple of months, right? I should
end of November, and I was just at the APA conference, and statewide, I think less than 100 applications have been submitted, and there's 529 jurisdictions that are eligible for this monies. The county got its money, and Folsom got its money.
Get creative about partnering with adjacent jurisdictions like Marin County is doing. Like they said, hey, we're just going to do this together. We're going to put our money in a pot and sort of have a much bigger effort that's kind of going to provide more of like a regional scale solution, a countywide scale solution, which I think is just super exciting and right in Marin County. Like that's really fantastic. And like, don't be afraid. We get caught up in this general plan cycle, and I know we find more and more, especially as we're doing our zoning code work, that the general plan doesn't set up the right framework for the zoning changes that need to be made, or for the, especially like application of housing choices more broadly. And I think Greg was telling me that him and his team did some research that 90% of residentially zoned lots in our region don't have the densities to allow missing middle housing. So that's a real eye opener, 90%. And so if we could get that to even 50%, right, that would be a huge sort of improvement, and it would go a long way. And so don't be afraid to do some of this targeted analysis prior to jumping. If you're going to do a bigger effort, don't be afraid to, like, before you jump into your jump and update, do some analysis first and put a framework in place for, hey, here's some really targeted things we need to make sure to check off in our general plan within the land use to enable missing middle, instead of getting caught up. I think what cities often get caught up in, like the big thing, and it's really complicated and it's challenging, and like they miss out on the details that are really necessary to enable especially the missing middle, but more broadly housing choices, geographically and policy and land use wide. So I think that's it. And what I would say is I would be happy. I don't have a lot of time to field emails, but I would be happy if people have a few targeted questions. Maybe it's through Greg, or you can take one of my business cards to send me questions. I'm thinking about this constantly, especially now that I'm trying to finish a book on the topic, and we're doing a lot of really great missing middle projects that are at the county scale down to single zoning district tweaks that we've learned a lot from, and even in the last, we've been doing this for a long time, but even the last 5 years we've learned a lot about sort of the real nuanced way to tweak and what's important to tweak. So.
And we would love, SACOG would love to bring Dan back for other reasons to help local jurisdictions. So we'll probably be talking over the course of time to somehow get more educational sessions and maybe have him work on projects and so forth. So, but anyway, contact me if you have questions about that. Yeah.
Would be good if we combined the proposals.
Yes, it would be good. We tried. We advertised this through APA and AIA. We should team up for a session with ULI is really where we
I will say what we have learned, because we've been brought into a lot of communities across the country, is you need to hold a separate event specifically for the development community, otherwise they will not likely come. I mean, there's no criticism in that necessarily, but like a lot of times the city will bring us in for a day and a half of like initiating the conversation, and we'll have a main event, public event, but then we will have like a breakfast or a lunch with developers where I can change my slides over that, focus mostly on how other developers are delivering it, and that's a real like eye opener for them. It's never as easy as all of a sudden they see the light. And but I didn't mention it, but we're working on a really exciting project that I can only say a little bit about, but it's going to be the country's largest car-free community. That's missing middle scale. So in the next 6 months, look out for that, because I think it's going to totally prove the fact that there are lots of people out there that, and not in the middle of the core of a city, that will choose to live without a car, and there's a lot of technology that's available to enable them to live that way. So it's exciting to be at that point, and I think we're just at a really critical point here where things are changing, but they need to change more rapidly, and it's projects like that that'll shake things up a little bit to sort of get developers thinking a little bit more outside the box. So.
Okay, well, why don't we give a hand to Dan and appreciate him coming out. Since we took a day of his time away from his staff in office to your office, appreciate bringing you out here. So
yeah, thank you everybody, and just good luck in your efforts.
Okay, all right, thank you much. Thanks, phone audience.
I do have